What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Bronx Pinstripe Show. Today, we're previewing the Mets as well as the NL East with Tim Britton, senior writer for The Athletic. He covers the New York Mets. Tim, what's up? Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Just a couple days from opening day. Excited about it.
The AL and NL East are shaping up to be two of the most exciting divisions in baseball. They were already last year as well, but not just most exciting, but also most competitive with all of the teams, specifically for the NL East, the Mets, the Braves, and the Phillies, all vying for that top spot.
Yeah, I mean, there's not many divisions. These are probably the only two in baseball where you can look around and say there are three legitimate World Series contenders in them. In the NL East, you've got Atlanta's won the division 5 years running. They won 101 games last year. They won the 2021 World Series. You've got Philly, who went to the World Series last year and looks like the kind of team that when it gets into the tournament is pretty dangerous once it gets there. And then you've got the Mets, who won 101 games last year and had very little to show for it come October. Atlanta caught them the last week of the season to win the division, and then the Mets bowed out in the wild card round against the Padres, and then spent a lot of money in the offseason to bring back many of the same guys, but with some replacement pieces in there as well. You've got Trey Turner and Sean Murphy joining the division as well. It's just going to be, I think, a 6-month-long battle among those teams at the top of the NL East.
Is that what Mets fans are grasping onto? It's going to be our turn this year. The other two teams have gone to the World Series the past 2 years, so now it's our turn.
I mean, you look at the last 3 full 162 game seasons, you had the Nationals win the World Series,
right.
Atlanta win the World Series, and Philly go to the World Series. So this, if you get a full season, the NL East usually wins out in the end, it seems.
I got to be honest with you, the 2019 season seems like a lifetime ago.
It is. I mean, ask Nationals fans, right?
Yeah. For sure. I don't even know if we're going to be spending a minute on them in this pod. But what the Mets did this offseason, obviously as Yankees fans and as a Yankees podcast, we like to just keep tabs with the Mets. And I'm not one of those Yankees fans that thinks everything the Mets do is awful. And I'm not like necessarily a Mets hater. I found just Steve Cohen to be fascinating and how he's operating to be fascinating. And the fact that they have just spent so much. And I know the Correa thing didn't work out. I actually think that might be a blessing in disguise for the Mets. But just like, what's your take on how he has been operating on we're just going to keep spending and we're not going to care what anyone else is saying?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting conversation kind of before the offseason of what would Steve Cohen do, because they had obviously a very good team last year, but to bring back most of the same players was going to take a significant investment above and beyond what last year's payroll was. So Cohen had told the New York Post late last season that, I think you can build a pretty good team for $300 million. And he had done that in 2022. But it was not going to be easy to do that for the 2023 Mets, and that's why their payroll is so much higher this year than it was last year. In order to bring back Edwin Diaz, you have to pay him more. In order to bring back Brandon Nimmo, you have to pay him more. In order to replace Jacob deGrom at the top of the rotation, you have to pay more for either him or someone like Justin Verlander. And so Cohen has kind of harped on this idea that this is the short-term plan. It's kind of like what the Dodgers did when Guggenheim Partners came in and owned them last decade. Spend a lot in the short term, build up the farm system, and hopefully, the next, by the time these contracts are running out 4 and 5 years from now, you have better replacements, younger players who can come in and you can pay more reasonable salaries to without needing to go to the open market. We'll see if that lasts, if that works out. You've got to develop the players. It doesn't always work out that way, but it's really nice when your plan B is the richest owner in the sport.
It only seems like the Braves are able to keep their young talent intact for somehow less money every year. But yeah, no, that's why I liked what they did. I liked pivoting from DeGrom to Verlander because of that short-term commitment to Verlander. And if you're just looking at it in a vacuum on who's going to be a better pitcher in the next year or two, it's frankly a coin flip, right? Like, DeGrom has more health concerns than Verlander, even though he recently had surgery, but he's been one of the most durable pitchers in history. So as far as like what this Mets team needed, it made a lot of sense to me. But DeGrom was the Met. He was the number one. He was the face of the Mets, in my opinion. Maybe Pete Alonso in more recent years, but DeGrom was the face of the Mets, and to let him walk, I thought took some balls. And was that decision met with any hate among fans?
I think the way the last couple seasons had gone for Jacob deGrom, really the last season and a half. So the All-Star break in 2021, where he's going into the All-Star break with, I think, a 1.08 ERA. His ERA had been under 1 the entire first half of the season until his last start before the break. and then doesn't pitch again the rest of that season. Misses the first 4 months of 2022. Comes back and doesn't look quite like quite like the dominant 1 ERA kind of ace that he had been the year before. I think that kind of prepared some fans. That this was not Jacob deGrom leaving after the second of 2 consecutive Cy Young awards. This wasn't Jacob deGrom leaving after excelling in the postseason the way he had in 2015. This was Jacob deGrom looking somewhat diminished at the end of last season, and then being replaced by a guy who just won the American League Cy Young Award. I do think, if you ask 30 Major League Baseball teams in a vacuum, you can have Justin Verlander for 2 years or Jacob deGrom for 5 at those numbers. I think most of them would take Verlander. The Mets did have to factor in that this is a generational player for your franchise, and probably, depending on how you feel about Doc Gooden, the second or third best pitcher in franchise history, and what value do you place on that? But I think, if deGrom had been lights out the way he had been for so long the last couple of years, it would have been a more difficult decision. The way he was kind of trending made it a little easier on the Mets and for the fan base to swallow.
And what has the vibe been after the Carlos Correa thing just fell apart?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a very weird offseason for that. With that it happened to, it wasn't just the Mets. I feel like the Giants were kind of vindicated by it also falling apart with the Mets. Steve Cohen had come out and said, I feel like this is the final piece. And when you say that, and the guy, you don't land the guy, and then you don't go out and get another final piece, it feels like an open parenthesis without being closed. And we'll see how that goes across the rest of the season, how that transpires for them, because the offense does feel at times when you look at it like it might be that one more middle of the order bat short, especially when you compare it to Philadelphia and Atlanta. So I think, like you said, it might be best long term for the Mets that this fell through with Correa. They've still got the chance to sign other free agents in other winters, but for the 2023 Mets, you'd probably rather have Carlos Correa than not.
Do you believe in karma at all?
Depends who I'm talking to.
I just felt like I've said this before with how Carlos Correa handled the whole Astros cheating scandal, a little bit of karma on what he went through this offseason. And I know he's still a great player. I'm not diminishing that. And he ended up signing for a lot of money in Minnesota still. He's not struggling, but just the 2 massive contracts that fell through. So a little part of me took joy in that. So the Edwin Diaz injury, I think, is obviously a massive blow to the Mets. He was going to be leading the bullpen. And I'm looking up and down that bullpen. I'm like, how the hell are they going to replace that? You can't replace Edwin Diaz there. But, I know there's Adam Ottavino and old friend David Robertson in the bullpen. But how are they going to replace those innings from Diaz?
Yeah, I mean, the really hard thing is even Edwin Diaz in 2023 was unlikely to be as good as 2022 Edwin Diaz, because that's kind of the standard that he had set for himself last season. So it's going to be a large drop off. I think, you look at the 3 guys they've talked about are Robertson, Ottavino, and lefty Brooks Raley. They could kind of go with matchups where if it's a bunch of tough righties, it's Ottavino. If it's a bunch of tough lefties, it's Raley. If it's a mix, it's Robertson because he's got reverse splits. I think in the end, it probably ends up being Robertson more often than not. He's got the most closing experience of the 3. He's got closing experience in New York. He's got closing experience in New York replacing a closer who was really, really good. So if you're drawing up kind of your ideal candidate to step in this role, it's someone who looks at least historically like David Robertson. You could be worried about the actual performance and how his season went last year, where he got off to an excellent start with the Cubs and kind of faded down the stretch with Philadelphia. The walk rate jumped up a little bit during his time with the Phillies. It's always been a little bit elevated. So, we'll see how that goes. But in terms of, you're not going to get a Diaz caliber reliever to replace him either within your own bullpen or even in July. But the Mets can feel like they've built enough depth to get by for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, the injury is obviously extremely unfortunate, especially because it happened in the WBC tournament, which I enjoyed this year, certainly enjoyed. And I wish even more stars played in the WBC. I wish Aaron Judge was playing it for Team USA in the WBC. But do you think injuries like that, or the Altuve injury, which I understand was a little bit of a fluke, is going to give even more hesitancy to some of these owners and GMs allowing their superstars to play next time around?
I mean, I think it really comes down to how the players feel, because there are, the players kind of get to make the decision. The team can kind of frown upon it from afar. But unless there is an injury going on, like the Mets had with Starling Marte wanted to play for the Dominican Republic, but because he was coming off offseason surgery, the Mets kind of nudge him more than they could a player who had a fully healthy offseason. So I think the quality of the games and the excitement of the tournament as a whole probably has more players excited to play in it in 2026 rather than them looking at a couple of kind of freakish injuries and being worried about it.
And you can get injured at any time. Like the Yankees nudged Luis Severino not to play, and then as it turns out, Luis Severino got hurt in Tampa. So it's like, who's to say, what the right thing to do is? It's extremely hard. I could put myself, like, I remember when Mark Teixeira went down in the 2013 WBC, and that kind of ruined his entire season for the Yankees. It's like, I mean, he wasn't even with the team and he got injured, and that sort of derails like a key cog to our lineup. That just sucked as a fan, right? So it's like I can understand how, those different views are and like why it's a really difficult decision.
Yeah, you see it from both sides, that if you're a player and the chance to suit up with, your nation's name across your chest, you don't get to do that very often. And especially for guys who are not from the U.S. originally and get to play for their home countries in front of raucous atmospheres. The Marlins Park does not look like or sound like it did in the WBC in June when the Mets come to visit for a 3-game series. So to play in that atmosphere is awesome for them and to play for their home country. And then for fans, if you grew up a Mets fan, a Yankees fan, a Cardinals fan, you're just thinking like, I don't care about this. The World Series is what matters. Right. And players don't always feel the same way.
So tell us a little bit about the rotation behind the two names everyone knows, obviously Scherzer and Verlander. Kodai Senga, am I saying that correctly? Kodai Senga,
yes,
who they signed out of Japan. What does he project to be at the major league level?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. It's harder to project a guy coming over from Japan than it is a guy who's just coming up through the minor leagues or from some other team. You look at Senga. I've looked at like what guys who make that transition from NPB to MLB look like. Taking kind of like an ERA plus from their time in Japan and what they look like in the major leagues, and he looks a little bit kind of like Hisashi Iwakuma did with the Mariners, a guy who kind of is not your number one starter. Maybe at times pitches like a number two, but kind of settles into a mid-rotation starter. I think that's kind of what the Mets hope is. To be fair, Senga struck out a lot more guys in Japan than Iwakuma did. It's a lot harder to strike out guys in Japan than it is here. And he had one of the highest strikeout rates of any starter over there. So I think that projects well for him. He works with a forkball, a splitter. That is his trademark pitch. He's struggled to throw it in spring training a bit because he's getting used to the larger baseball. But that is a pitch we've seen.
I remember that with Tanaka.
With Tanaka and with, I used to cover the Red Sox. They had Koji Uehara and Junichi Tozawa. Both of them really utilized a forkball to great effect out of the bullpen. So the thought is, if he gets that pitch going, that it can be really effective because you just don't see many like it. He threw live BP to a couple hitters earlier this spring, and Pete Alonso said, "I've never seen a pitch quite like that." And so the hope from the Mets side is that you pay a little, you get a pitcher for a little bit less salary wise because of the risk there, but you hope that there's a higher reward in him than there would be in, say, re-signing Taijuan Walker, who went to Philadelphia for a similar price.
Right, yeah, because the salary is one thing I wanted to bring up, because 5 for 75, that was about half of what Tanaka got from the Yankees. And like you said, Tanaka was a number one pitcher. There was no question about that. And I think that was the unanimous opinion when he came over from Japan. But to me, if you're getting a solid 3 with 2 upside for $75 million, that seems like really good value. I understand there's unknown there. I understand he's already 30 years old and Tanaka was like 26 when he came over. So it's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. But if you're just looking at it from pure value, what the going rate for a good starting pitcher is in today's game, that seems like good value.
Yeah, I mean, and you looked at what happened in the free agency market for those kind of mid-rotation guys last year, guys like Walker, guys like Jameson.
Everyone's getting $19 million.
Yeah, they made a lot of money, and so getting a guy who might be better than those guys, you feel has a chance to be better than them, that maybe has a little bit more upside than your usual 30-year-old starter. That's what the Mets were looking for.
I mean, even if they're comparable, you're saving 30% on the client. I know Steve Cohen; he needs the extra couple $1 million. Like, what's he going to do? So let's talk about it in context to the rest of the division. I was looking at Zip's projections before we started recording, and the Braves and Mets are both projected to win 94 games. And surprisingly, the Phillies 9 games behind them, which I know the Phillies got super hot towards down the stretch. They rode that to the World Series. But how do you see this division shaking out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference between Atlanta and New York at the top of the division and Philly a little bit behind them is probably just the depth on the rosters. You look at what Philadelphia might have. If they're without Rhys Hoskins probably for the whole season. They're without Bryce Harper for at least the first couple months into June. They don't have kind of the guys who just step up and fill in pretty easily, pretty seamlessly there. They're reaching into their depth a little bit more than the Mets or Braves might in a similar situation. So I think that's what separates them over 162 games. I've covered Dave Dombrowski. It's a very Dave Dombrowski roster. It's top heavy. It's got a lot of stars. Their fourth starter might be Bailey Falter at the start of the year. Their fifth starter might be Matt Strahm, but eventually they'll get there. And you look at what that team might do to you in October. If you've got Nola, you've got Wheeler, Walker's now the number 3 starter in there. Ranger Suarez is pretty good, and you've got a middle of the order that includes Real Muto, Harper, Trey Turner, Nick Castellanos, like that. Yeah, you see why that's a Kyle Schwarber. Like that's a really good lineup. That's tough to get out. And so I think that's what makes Philadelphia probably more dangerous in October than they are April to September. Of course, they could come out and win 100 games. I don't think it would surprise anyone if they went out and did that. I just look at it. Atlanta to me is the team in the division. It has the most answers to whatever questions the season's going to bring up. Like if they have problems in their rotation, okay, they've got Mike Soroka, who almost won Rookie of the Year in 2019. They've got Ian Anderson, who was a postseason hero for them in 2021. Their bullpen, they've got a couple different possible answers, like Nick Anderson, a guy who was really good for the Rays a couple of years ago, is starting off in AAA for them. And you look at what their roster did last year. Sure, Michael Harris II might not be quite as good as he was after he got called up last year and won Rookie of the Year, but Ronald Acuna Jr. is probably going to be better, and Matt Olson's probably going to be better. And though they lost Dansby Swanson, they bring in Sean Murphy, a guy who, if you've ever looked at his home road splits, is probably going to be a lot better away from the Oakland Coliseum than he was playing there. So that's what separates them, I think, from. I mean, I'd pick Atlanta to win probably any division in baseball.
So that's exactly what I was going to say. So I was reading something that said that they believe that the Braves roster has the highest floor of any contender in Major League Baseball. Doesn't mean they're going to be the best team, but just that having the highest floor, especially going into a long season, can be the differentiating factor between winning a division. But now more so than ever, the Phillies have proved this. The Nationals proved this a couple of years ago. Many teams have proven this. You just got to get in the tournament, and the tournament's now expanded. The regular season now is going to be even more with the balanced schedule. I think going to be benefiting some teams like the Mets and the Yankees and teams in these tough divisions that can beat up on some of these other divisions a little bit more than having to play 19 times against the Phillies, 19 times against the Braves. So it's just about getting in the tournament, and whether you like that or not, like that's not what I'm sort of getting at. Like fans, it goes back and forth. Like, oh, baseball should be like how it was the old way. It's like you got to win your division or else you don't get into the playoffs because it's 162 games. But really, like you see these rosters, you're like, yeah, I could see how that could be a really tough out in a 5 or 7 game series.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the playoffs worked out in that expanded format the first season, because in the American League, you had pretty much chalk. I think Seattle upset Toronto in the wild card series, but otherwise the team that home field advantage won each series there.
Yep.
Well, in the National League, it was the opposite of that. You had the 6 seed beating the 5 seed in the NLCS, and a lot of chaos over there. So you can see both ways it can go. I don't, it used to be that you'd worry sometimes that some general managers would look at that last wild card and say, why are we going to try to push our chips into the table just to play one game against a really good team on the road, to play one game at Dodger Stadium or something like that. But now that you've got a 3-game series, it probably incentivizes some teams to try to win that 87th, 88th game a little bit more than it used to.
And then the argument that we were so graciously got to witness as the owners and the players were fighting to get back onto the field after the COVID season is that the expanded playoffs allows more markets to be in it in September. And even if you're fighting for the last wild card spot to go play at Dodger Stadium, if you're playing meaningful baseball games throughout the month of September, that's valuable to a franchise.
Yeah, and I think what you want to see, so many teams have made the decision over the last decade that there's no difference between going 75 and 87 and 55 and 107.
Right.
And to me, there's still a pretty large gap there. And that, now if you're looking at your team and you think, we might only win 75 games, but, if a couple things break our way, if we add one big piece, then maybe we're winning 84 games, and that might be enough to get us in. You hope that's how teams look at it. I'm not sold that is how they're going to look at it, but you hope that that's what drives them more.
I guess the counter argument there, like you point at the Astros and how they tanked for basically most of the decade, and then all of a sudden their roster was filled with these young superstars, and they won. I think they lost, excuse me, a couple times, well over 100 games, if I'm not wrong. And so,
Yeah, I think they lost 106 or more 3 straight years.
And so for them, they clearly had a plan, and that plan was tank. And
yeah, so it's and we'll see how it plays out for other teams. Like the Tigers have tried that, and it hasn't worked out.
Yeah, the Tigers are a confusing team.
The Pirates are still in the midst of it. Like the Orioles are on year 6 of.
But they had a really positive jump forward last year, and
yeah, so we'll see if like that was kind of what Houston did in, I think, 2015, the year they first made the playoffs. Was get up above 500 and then see where it goes. The thing is, Houston reinvested in that roster at that point. They ran super low payrolls for a while. When the roster got good, they were bringing in Josh Reddick and Carlos Beltran and some other free agents.
Verlander at the deadline to paying him a boatload of money.
And the same, when the Cubs took their step back, they started signing John Lester and guys like that to big money deals. We haven't seen the Orioles get to that point, with some other teams, Pittsburgh and Detroit. Are they going to spend that amount of money to keep a good core if and when that core arrives?
A couple more things I want to touch on before we wrap up. Do you think Steve Cohen is conscious of headlines in New York and competing with the Yankees for headlines?
I think he's a PR conscious guy.
Yeah.
You don't get to his point. You get to where he is without knowing a little bit about what's going on in terms of public relations. I don't think he's not, the prior ownership with the Wilpons was very conscious about it and kind of, wanted the back page as often as possible, tried to win the back page in a way that I think Cohen believes it'll probably happen more organically for him than it ever did for the Wilpons.
Well, do you think he's as obsessed with it as George Steinbrenner was?
No, I don't know that anyone could.
No one was, really, because Hal Steinbrenner clearly is not, right? I'm not saying Hal Steinbrenner doesn't want to be the number one team in the city. I'm not naive. Of course he does. And he wants there to be good press about the Yankees. He wants better press than the Mets. But I think it's much more, we're just going to be running a stable organization that's got a good business model. And yes, we want to win the World Series, but we also want to be mindful of, how much money we're making or losing every year. So yeah, that's something that was curious how Cohen would act once he came in, because he sort of gave me a little bit of George Steinbrenner vibes.
Yeah, I mean, you talked. I did a big story on him when he bought the team and talked to different people, and they would say, it's going to be like George Steinbrenner. We just don't know how he's going to respond to the losing, because this was a guy who did not respond well to losing when it's his money in a hedge fund.
Right.
That he's known for his temper on Wall Street. But he's kind of taken it in stride for the most part so far. There have been a couple tweets here and there, especially in the 21 season, that rankled, whether it's his own front office, his own clubhouse. He's saying he's never seen hitters be this unproductive, if I remember the phrasing right. He's learned from that.
If George Steinbrenner had Twitter back in the 80s.
I think it's funny how because of the success the Yankees had really the last 15 years of George's life, there is this thought that he was always the best owner you could be. And then you can go back to what things were like for them in the 80s and early 90s. It was, George Steinbrenner was far more an obstacle than a propelling force for them.
I think so. I'm about to be 35 years old. I grew up in the 90s. That was my team. That was my generation. I really don't remember at all the early 90s. So I've read and learned about it. People don't acknowledge this enough. The only reason the Yankees dynasty was able to happen is because George was banned from baseball. Okay. So it's let's not forget that fact. Did he do a lot of good things for the organization? Of course. But that fact definitely remains. All right. Last question for you. I've been asking everybody that we've been doing these preview episodes with, what new rule are you most looking forward to this year?
I mean, I'd be disingenuous if I didn't say, as a beat reporter who's at games all the time and whose working hours are defined by how long the game is, that it isn't the pitch clock. I think in terms of intrigue, I would like to see more stolen bases, and I'm interested in seeing how these slightly larger bases. I think that the rule with disengagements, as much as I hate saying the word disengagement as often as I'm going to have to this year, that intrigues me the most, to see if we do get more stolen bases, because that's such a fun part of the game. You go back and watch a game from the 1980s, and guys are running all over the place. That is a fun way to play the sport, and we just haven't seen it a lot in the last year.
Yeah, I was reading an article yesterday that said the year of the stolen base was the headline, and guys talking about, yes, the larger base, but also the pitch clock is going to be a factor there. To your point about speeding up the game, but just having that pitch clock and the pickoff attempt rules all sort of bubbling up to probably more stolen bases. I'm definitely most excited about the pitch clock as well. I have a little bit of tempered expectations for the shift. I don't know how much it's actually going to impact things. I'm kind of going to be in a wait and see mindset there.
Yeah, I think, some of the early research before it was put into place didn't think it would have too much of an impact. In spring, it did have a little bit more than I expected, so I'm intrigued by that as well to see how it goes. But the pitch clock tells me when I'm getting, it helps me get home earlier than otherwise. So I like that.
Well, you don't like those 3 hour and 54-minute 3-2 games with 19 walks and 4 solo home runs is the only scoring.
I covered a lot of Red Sox Yankees games in my life,
yeah.
So I know those well. I know those too well.
Absolutely. The Sunday night 4-hour games were always the best. Yes. By best, I mean the worst.
4 hour was nice. You'd take 4 hours going into it.
Yeah. All right, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun. Go check out Tim on Twitter at Tim Britton. He covers the Mets, but also obviously baseball for The Athletic. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.